Sarah and I are going to do this session. We have 3 questions. I'm going to just say what they are now so you can think about them. But we will put them up towards the end anyway. So, where are the opportunities for powerful literacies today? What resources and allies can help further them? What might get in the way, and how can these obstacles be managed or reduced? So those are the questions we would like to ask you. We will put those up at the end, but just in case you kind of wanted to have a wee think about them. Okay. Well, first of all, an apology, because I decided I kind of would get a bit ahead of myself, and I've got a new smartphone. And so I decided to write my notes on the smartphone and my PowerPoint on the smartphone. But I'm not as smart as the phone, unfortunately. So I lost my PowerPoint. It's somewhere, I don't know. Fortunately, I was able to print out these, otherwise, this could be quite rambling. Anyway, so I don't have to go over there. I don't have to kind of flick, but you have to, sort of stay with the fact that there would have been some PowerPoint slides, but we don't have them. Just to say, in terms of literacy, what I'm thinking about is always text is somewhere involved in literacy. Now, obviously, kind of in the age of social media, it's kind of linked with visual, iconic information, but always there's some kind of degree of text is connected in there. Now, people might say, well, there's oral literacy, and okay, I kind of sort of tend to my working definition, in a sense, is excluding that to some degree. But I think there's something that has to hold the idea of literacy or literacies together, and that has something to do with text. Okay. And I wanted to start, this is my first slide, was Ideologies of Literacy Practice from Mary Hamilton. And it's in a chapter in a book that Sarah has over there. And she talks about 4 distinct ideologies of literacy. Literacy for social control is a kind of way of shaping functionally and morally responsible people who will be economically productive citizens. Now, we've all heard of that one. I should. Literacy as a cultural missionary activity. Now, that ideology has some strong roots, probably in a kind of religiously influenced kind of work around reading the Bible and so on historically. But my own experience of working in the 1980s in what's called basic education at that point was kind of like transformed into a cultural missionary activity of bringing enlightenment, access to poor people who hadn't acquired literacy skills. It was kind of there. It wasn't stated so openly like that, but you can get the sense of that. Literacy is a remedial activity for poor people who didn't quite have the capacity to acquire it at school. So it was kind of part of that. People with learning difficulties that needed some remedial help. And then finally, she says literacy as an emancipatory activity, obviously linked with kind of critiques of dominant culture, ways in which schooling or limited forms of schooling was available to people, limited types of knowledge, and implied a radical critique of existing things as they existed and what needed to be done to change things. So part of literacy was always kind of linked to some sense of action to change things. So 2 points to take from these kind of 4 distinctions. One, the purpose and practice of literacy is contested. We often just kind of assume somehow or other that it's straightforward, that it's just one type of thing. But clearly there are different things going on all the time in what we think about literacy. And that the radical tradition, which is what we're focused on, was always part of a kind of independent working class education. Independent from the state, from religious influence and so on. And it was to serve the interests of working class communities and other marginalised or exploited groups. So literacy was, woven into the fabric of organisations were about to sort of resist at a community level. And, you know, we talk about adult education histories, and when Sharon was kind of referring to Raymond Williams about, you know, adult education is in change. It's about the process of social change. It's not about adult education history, adult education in history, making history, part of that kind of fundamental change. Now, I can only just kind of sketch a few things, leaving out tons of stuff, which is obviously unnecessary. But if we take the long view, we go back way beyond 100 years, obviously, of radical education. For example, in 1822, there were 51 Scottish working class controlled libraries without any middle class influence. Now, I don't know if I'm getting this pronunciation correct, the Wanlock Head. Wanlock Head? It's in Dumfries, Galway. Have I got it right? It's in Dumfries, Galway. One of the first was founded in 1756. Part of that kind of tradition of working class communities. So lots of kind of Fife and so on, they would produce their own kind of libraries because they needed to use knowledge to further their own particular interests. So these institutions were the tip of an iceberg of a growing kind of radical political, social culture that wanted to sort of like educate themselves into looking at examining the inequalities and so on that existed and what they could do about them. But they were not explicitly political in any sort of simple sense. They provided a wide range of literature for a wide range of interests that people would become sort of involved in. But what was learned, and that was much in the tradition of kind of the idea of mutual improvement, rather than sort of like a radical, necessarily some radical end. But for instance, many of the Chartist papers, now moving forward from the 17th into the 1830s, 1840s, many of the Chartist papers actually suppressed the political content to include a much wider range of material within them. As one such convert to Chartism remarked, the poetry of Coleridge and Shelley was stirring within me and making me a Chartist and something much more. Now that's in the Jonathan Rose, the intellectual history of the British working class, fantastic kind of book. And the democracy movement of the 1830s, 40s and so on provided a rich sort of like range of material, informal situations, the kind of things that Sharon was talking about, and provided their own institutions and ideas which would help shape the values and the actions that they needed to take. The struggle for the vote throughout the 19th century came and went, but it was also always part of that kind of wider struggle for dignity and human equality, and that kind of always occurred within it. The Committee for Public Libraries in 1849 noted that it led to, direct quote, exercising the minds of the labouring classes better than any school instruction. And that's in a book by Dobbs, I think it's Alex Dobbs, written in 1919, 1918 maybe, on education and social movements. Fantastic collection that he's got in that book. That Committee on Public Libraries called this process of participation education by collision. Education by collision, and there were lots of collisions taking place. Traditional kind of authorities running up against science, reason, those kind of collisions. The collisions between the need for the growing kind of discipline of factory life and the earlier popular cultural ways of living. The collision between widespread poverty and opulence. That people were beginning to question why did they live in such a rich society and be so poor. And so we have a kind of literacy linked to the kind of a growth of a thriving culture, challenging, opinionated, questioning, and that book by Edward Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class, a fantastic kind of resource for it. And John Stuart Mill, the key liberal philosopher of that period, commented that the position which gives the strongest stimulus to the growth of intelligence is that of rising to power, not that of having achieved it. So there you go, Boris Johnson. Of course, like there's a huge range of examples of social and political movements and institutions that, provided a kaleidoscope of kind of demands for an independent working class education. And as the 1990 report recognised, and here's a quote, the growth of movements which have their aim, the creation of a better social order, is not less important than the process of education itself. Such movements create the background of aspiration and endeavour, which is the foundation of more directly educational work. What I wish to highlight, kind of relevant to my theme, is that this involved in Freirian terms the practice of reading the word and reading the world. They are mutually constitutive, creating the kind of possibilities for literacy to be in history, to be an essential part of those struggles for emancipation. I'm not quite sure if I've got what time. Fast forward very quickly then. The modern history of radical literacy, at least outside of Scotland, is associated with clearly Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a way of working, teaching with the oppressed. This philosophy that education was never neutral, had to be grounded in the generative themes from people's lives. That the appropriate methodology for liberating was dialogical, and that people had teacher and student were interchangeable in their roles, all that kind of bringing together of an ontological equality into the educational experience. So, I mean, it's been a dramatic, kind of powerful influence in terms of the practice of radical literacies, but I would say not so much in Scotland, actually. More generally in the field of adult education, but probably less kind of specific to the practice of literacy in Scotland. But, kind of getting to where we are now, this idea can be connected very clearly with the idea of literacy as a social practice. Now that kind of notion underpinned the Adult Literacy and Numeracy in Scotland report in 2001, and is still seen as a core element of kind of literacy's practice. The idea that it's social, that people, it's a reciprocal process of people in relationships using text as a part with other things as well, but using kind of literacies because it relates to their context, their issues, their interests, and the idea that you build on people's wealth, the knowledge, the experience they bring to the situation, and so that social kind of the sense of a social dimension to the practices of literacy is really kind of key, and that has been exploited by workers to be able to do a whole range of different types of literacy practices, and not simply started from the idea of somehow or other, it's like more of a remedial model. There's a kind of adult literacy student at the bottom rung of the ladder, and they slowly will work their way up and kind of put in a dipstick and measure where they are and so on. So it kind of challenges that notion. Of course, kind of literacy practitioners have to be artful, they have to be thoughtful, they have to look into the struggles of different communities. In one of the anthologies that we produced with Mary Hamilton and Lynn Tare, John, I've got to mention John Player's work on football literacies, using the common interest as social practice, what brings people together to examine the world, globalization, racism, economic inequalities, homophobia, sexism, all these things providing a reading of the world that was used to also write the word, to deconstruct texts and to reconstruct them, so to develop a kind of richness in their literacy practices. So I would really kind of recommend John's chapter in there. Alan Addison, who was involved in Scots family literacy practices, using the language of people in poor communities in north part of Edinburgh, using their everyday language as part of a resource for writing plays, for educating children and for educating adults. And that kind of powerful recognition that the adults who were involved in these activities, that this was okay, it was acceptable. This wasn't just kind of inadequate English, this was a natural language of the home, the family and the community. And therefore, it was a resource. So in conclusion, radical and empowering literacies need to connect or reconnect the word and the world. That is what makes them powerful. Literacy is not a technical, neutral activity divorced from context. Always part of that social practice. And as the history of radical education, it's always part of that shared struggles of people trying to make some difference to their world. So the lesson of history, as long as the world is a problem, there is always going to be struggles for democracy and dignity and human equality. There will always be context for empowering literacies until we crack those problems. Science of practice may change. Policy context may alter that. But those enduring issues are there and they will not go away, and therefore they are science for radical empowering literacies. And so, our question is, where are the opportunities today? Where are the problems? How do we engage with those? And we must, we cannot sit back, as kind of Freire has said, you sit back from that, you side with the powerful. You haven't got a choice. Thank you very much.